to memory dear. Our hearts return there year by year. 'Tis there to be, to know, to do, became for us our motto true. The years may pass, our ways may part, and still we sing with happy hearts. Oh, Russell Sage, we sing to thee, our voices raised in melody. Oh, Russell Sage, our college dear, we love thee more each passing year. In thy dear halls by Hudson Stream, we work, we play, we fondly dream, and so we strive with mind and heart in life's great game to play our part. The happy days pass swiftly by, and yet we sing with courage high. Oh, Russell Sage, we sing to thee, our voices raised in melody. Oh, Russell Sage, our college dear, we love thee more each passing year.
Hey, good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Ames, president of Russell Sage College, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the fourth in a series of 5 events sponsored by the Women's Institute, reflecting on the centennial of the 19th Amendment. These lectures, panels, and discussions have used the centennial as a lens to look upon our present moment and to enrich our understanding of the history that informs it. Previous sessions have looked at the role of gender in elections, the current opportunities for women in politics and activism, and contemporary struggles with voting rights on the eve of a presidential election. The 5th and final session, please mark your calendars for October 20th, will examine the role of Indigenous peoples in influencing the suffrage movement. So in that context, today's speaker, Professor Martha S. Jones, could not be a better fit. Her newly published book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, complicates our view of suffrage and individual and collective agency in illuminating ways that shine a light on our current struggles over voting and racial and gender equity as well. Now, as a literature professor myself, I was moved by Dr. Jones beginning her historical study with a reference to Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Garden, a landmark collection that demonstrated that the works and contributions of our ancestors that had not been recorded in conventional histories could be discovered and reclaimed if we knew how to look for them. Vanguard is a rich work of history in this spirit, and it changes the way we think of race, suffrage, gender, and political activism in essential ways. Speaking of one of the key figures of the book, Ida B. Wells, Professor Jones notes that Wells always defied boundaries between political movements. This was the style that so many Black women have adopted. Winning the vote was one facet of a vision that aimed to win dignity for all humanity. That breadth of vision weaves together the histories of so many remarkable Black women in Vanguard, and it could not be more relevant for today. So thank you all for joining us. And now to formally introduce Professor Jones, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Shelley Calabrese, Interim Director of the Women's Institute at Russell Sage College. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As President Ames mentioned, this is the 4th event in our Deeds Not Words series celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage. While the centennial is indeed a moment of great significance in American history, it is equally important to acknowledge that the 19th Amendment did not guarantee the right to vote for all women, and it is not a time of celebration for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other women of color who did not see their voting rights ensured until the 1964 Civil Rights and 1965 Voting Rights Acts, more than 40 years later. Tonight, it is my great honor to introduce Professor Martha S. Jones for a discussion of her newly released book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. Vanguard explores a new history of African American women's political lives in America, how they defied both racism, sexism to fight for the ballot, and how they wielded political power to secure the equality and dignity of all persons. Professor Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. She is the author of Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America. All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 through 1900, and co-editor of Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women. She currently serves as president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians and on the executive board of the Organization of American Historians. Professor Jones is also recognized as a public historian, frequently writing for broader audience at outlets including The Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and Time. She has curated museum exhibitions including Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation in conjunction with the William L. Clements Library, and collaborations with the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, the American Experience, the Southern Poverty Law Center, PBS, Netflix, and Art France. Professor Jones holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a JD from the CUNY School of Law. Prior to the start of her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City, recognized for her work as a Charles H. Revson Fellow on the future of the City of New York at Columbia University. And now, welcome Professor Jones.
Thank you so much, Professor Calabrese. And thank you to President Ames and everybody there at Russell Sage College for bringing us together under unprecedented circumstances, but it makes it all the more meaningful, this opportunity to come together to reflect upon this centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Is very inspired by the deeds, not words, framing of our discussion. And I hope that the women of Vanguard will add something new to your reflections on this important framing. My theme this evening is indeed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution as we mark its centennial. And my purpose to an important degree is to help us move, continue to move away from myth and toward history. The story of the amendment is, in my view, one facet of a broader national reckoning with the past, especially a reckoning with the role that racism has played in shaping our nation. My hope is that through this opportunity to better understand what happened in 1920 and in its wake, we can better move forward. Now, mention to me that you're celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, and perhaps it won't surprise you that I might cringe a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong. As you've heard, I've just finished a book about the history of Black women in the vote. And so I'm as interested as anyone in this anniversary and its significance to the nation's past. And still, I can't quite bring a spirit of celebration to the occasion. I worry that it might just get in the way of the story I have to tell. When we appreciate what an open secret Black women's disenfranchisement was in 1920, the facts of the 19th Amendment fit only awkwardly with events that feature light shows or period costumes and marching bands. In 1920, members of Congress who promulgated the 19th Amendment, state lawmakers who ratified it, and suffragists themselves all understood that nothing in its terms prohibited states from strategically using poll taxes, literacy tests, and understanding clauses to keep Black women from registering to vote. Nothing in the new amendment promised to curb the intimidation and violence that threatened Black women who came out to polling places. Voting rights and voter suppression went hand in hand in 1920. Now, I'm a historian, and fortunately for me, and perhaps for you, nothing in my job requires that I plan commemorative festivities. Instead, my work is to cut through half-truths and myths about the past and equip us with the critical tools we need to think about the future of our democracy. 25 years ago, historian Michel Rolfe-Triot looked back on the celebrations that marked 500 years since 1492, the year in which Christopher Columbus had long been said to have discovered the Americas. Triot warned historians away from such occasions, lest we be drawn into promoting sanitized partial truths, even myths that the occasion demanded. The difficult history of European contact and conquest with the indigenous people of the Americas, including that of Columbus, was muted and even omitted altogether in efforts to cast that anniversary as a year of celebration. Such framings may have filled the coffers of tourist venues and souvenir sellers, but they did too little to promote critical understanding of how colonialism devastated the people and the lands of the hemisphere. So when I'm asked why I'm staying home from celebrations in 2020, I note that the centennial of the 19th Amendment does indeed mark a milestone in the history of the American story of voting rights. I add that remembering the era of voter suppression 100 years ago may help us to see more clearly how ballots are being withheld from Americans in our own time. It may even encourage us to recommit to the ongoing work of ensuring voting rights for all Americans. And I'm eager to contribute the stories of Black women to our collective understanding of the 19th Amendment. But as a nation, we are not yet ready for that grand celebration. The promise of voting rights for all still remains out on the horizon. So what happened in August 1920 when the 19th Amendment became part of the Constitution? Let's start with two myths. When it comes to the story of women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment, there are two, I think, that predominate. The first is that when the 19th Amendment became law, all American women won the vote. We even hear that women were thereby guaranteed the right to vote. But the second myth is one that, in a sense, runs directly counter to the first. It is that no Black women gained the vote in 1920, that racism kept all African American women from the polls, even after a federal amendment. So in this anniversary year, in our short time together, I hope I can move us forward in replacing some of those myths with history. Voting rights in America have always been born of struggle, and the battles waged 100 years ago echo in 2020 as American women continue to work against voter suppression and for full access to the polls. So let's go back to August of 1920, when the US Secretary of State indeed certified that the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution had been ratified in the required 36 states. Let's just take a moment to look at the language of the amendment itself. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So what precisely did that mean for American women? Now, laws that reserved the ballot for men violated the Constitution. No longer were there provisions that included the word male as a requirement for access to the polls enforceable. Still, the 19th Amendment did not promise women the vote, and state laws still kept them from the polls based upon age, residency, citizenship, mental competence. In 1920, it was still true that American women who married non-US citizens were denaturalized and lost their citizenship and their right to vote. The women who showed up to register in the fall of 1920 confronted many hurdles, even if sex was no longer one of them. Of course, one additional barrier to women's votes persisted even after a federal amendment, and that was racism. It was true that the 15th Amendment in 1870 had expressly forbid states from denying the vote because of race, But by 1920, lawmakers in the South and in the West had set in place hurdles that, while silent on their face about race, had the net effect of disenfranchising Black Americans. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses effectively kept many Black men from casting their ballots since the 1890s. Unchecked intimidation and the threat of lynching sealed the deal. Local voting officials effectively constructed a color line without ever expressly invoking race. So did American women win the vote in 1920? Not all women. African American women in too many states became, if you will, merely equals to their fathers and husbands. State laws disenfranchised them in an end run around the spirits of the 15th and the 19th Amendments. And the registration numbers reflected the effects of discriminatory laws. In the fall of 1920, Black women presented themselves to voting officials, but many found that the books were closed. And still, the first waves of Black women voters were unleashed as individual states made women's suffrage the law. In California, starting in 1911, Illinois in 1913, and New York State in 1917, Black women were experienced voters by 1920, even more than joined them, managing to register and cast ballots in the fall of 1920 in the wake of the 19th Amendment. Let's look at a couple of examples together. In St. Louis, Missouri, Black women organized their headquarters in the city's Black YWCA, the Phyllis Wheatley branch, named for the 18th century enslaved poet. There, Black women ran a suffrage school and prepared for their chance to register, teaching one another how to pay poll taxes and pass literacy tests, even when they were administered by begrudging officials. And Black women turned out. Papers reported that nearly every woman in the city of St. Louis, Black and white, registered that season. Now, Black women organized to register and vote, not only as an affirmation of their own full citizenship, not only to claim women's political power. African American women come out in St. Louis because they know that as recently as 1916, city officials had been using Election Day to put in place citizen referenda that installed housing segregation for the first time by law in the city of St. Louis. In 1916, African American men had come to the polls in that city only to find themselves confronted by police who arrested them on false charges, others who intimidated them. In 1960, the record was such that 3,000 Black men had been deprived of the opportunity to cast ballots at all, and another 900 ballots, which had been cast, had not been counted. Democratic Party officials in St. Louis were adamant not only on setting in place segregation laws that would increasingly marginalize Black members of the city's body politic and Black Americans overall in St. Louis, they were adamant about ensuring that Black men had no say. So when Black women in the Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YWCA organized, this is what they have on their minds. And their mission is so clear that African American men also turn out to their suffrage schools, thinking that the tactics and the strategies of Black women might help to get Black men to the polls as well. And before the season is over, Black women are now somewhere between 10 and 20% of the newly registered voters in the city of St. Louis. It is a success story. Contrast that to the story of Daytona, Florida, where educator and member of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, Mary McLeod Bethune, was traveling the state in 1920 to encourage Black women to register to vote. Bethune is her own suffrage school in many senses, encouraging Black women, whether they are organized in Y's or they are organized in church associations or they are organized in clubs, Bethune is traveling Florida to teach women how to register and vote and to fuel their courage and their resolve. But she, along with all of those among Black Americans in Florida who are out there to increase Black presence at the polls, all Black voting rights advocates are met with brutal opposition in 1920, organized by the Ku Klux Klan, which plagues Black voters with intimidation, but also with outright violence, some of it brutal, even some of it fatal. And Mrs. Bethune is no exception. She has won the attention of the Ku Klux Klan. And on election eve in 1920, white-robed Ku Klux Klansmen on horseback, after burning a cross in the river there in Daytona, march first downtown in the city and then head out to Mrs. Bethune's school, her industrial school for African American girls. They will march onto the grounds of the school in an effort to intimidate her faculty, and to intimidate all the Black women in Daytona who have already registered. That season, the Klan fails in Daytona. Black women do turn out that next day, on election day, to cast their ballots. And they reveal to us another facet of their strategy. They turn out in numbers, they turn out in groups, they turn out en masse, hoping that their sheer numbers will help them resist the intimidation and the threat of violence that has visited them the night before. And in 1920, Black women in Daytona are successful in casting their ballots, but the violence will persist. Again, in 1922, Klansmen will come out in downtown Daytona, gather, and head out to Mrs. Bethune's, the grounds of her school. And then that season, she, along with many of those who were looking to not only establish their right to vote, but to use their influence at the polls on election day, will be not permanently, but for a very long time, discouraged. Mrs. Bethune herself will take up a new set of tactics, heading to Washington, D.C., founding the National Council of Negro Women, organizing Black women nationally, in an end run around the problem of disfranchisement in the ongoing violence unchecked by lawmakers in the state of Florida. So what are Black women to do in 1920? As they look out across the expanse of the country, what they see is this uneven landscape. Places like California and New York and the city of Chicago in Illinois, where they are able to come to the polls. Places like St. Louis, where working the ground game of politics in an election season can make a difference and get Black women to the polls. And still in too many places like Daytona, Florida, unchecked violence and intimidation will discourage and keep Black women from the polls. What to do? Hallie Quinn Brown, who is not a household name perhaps yet, but is someone whom I hope you'll remember after our conversation this evening. Hallie Quinn Brown in 1920 is the president of the National Association of Colored Women, the largest association of political association of African American women in the country. Their numbers are upwards of 300,000 across the United States, organized in local clubs, stitched together under the auspices of a national organization. And Hallie Quinn Brown has prepared for this moment. She was an educator, a faculty member at Ohio's Wilberforce University, trained as an elocutionist in Western New York's Chautauqua Institute, a political leader within her faith community, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where as early as the 1890s, she had run for office looking to head the AME Church's education department. When the National Association of Colored Women is founded in 1896, Hallie Quinn Brown is there. And by the early 20th century, she will head the NACW's suffrage department. She is an old and long-standing suffragist. So in 1920, she is as tuned in and as committed as anyone might be to the problem of how now to tackle the ongoing disenfranchisement of Black women despite a federal amendment. And Brown sets her sights on a remedy, and that is federal legislation. She organizes the NACW to work now in a new movement for voting rights that will win women of the United States, including Black women, federal legislation out of Congress that will give teeth to the 19th Amendment. Brown is looking for federal laws that will override, in essence, the ongoing disfranchisement of Black women by state laws in too many places. She looks to build a coalition and is understandably impressed with the women who led the National Women's Party and the National Association, the National American Suffrage Association on the road to the 19th Amendment. And she reaches out to Alice Paul, who has headed the National Women's Party and is well known for her radical and very effective political tactics, including political theater, that are underneath the success of the 19th Amendment. She writes to Alice Paul with two purposes. The first is she knows that Paul is organizing celebrations in connection with ratification of the 19th Amendment. In particular, Paul is presiding over the unveiling of a statue to some of the nation's earliest suffragists, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the Quaker activist Lucretia Mott. There is going to be a ceremony in the Capitol. And she writes to Paul, Brown does, to say, please, would you send me the details? Hallie Quinn Brown intends to make sure that Black American women are there for that celebration, that they continue to keep a seat at the table of women's suffrage politics. And Alice Paul obliges. There is a elaborate pageant in February of 1921 in the Capitol Rotunda for this unveiling. And Brown is there along with a contingent of women from the NACW to represent African American women at the unveiling. But Brown has a second purpose, and it is to win an alliance between the NACW and the National Women's Party, one that would work in collaboration toward the winning of federal legislation that would finally come to guarantee Black women's votes after 1920. And she calls on Paul behind the scenes with a contingent of women from the NACW to propose this collaboration. And while the precise wording of their exchanges has not survived, we know the net result, which is in the winter of 1921, Alice Paul will fold up the National Women's Party. That will be the last year that the party will meet in a national convention. And she herself will move on to a new cause, that of winning another amendment to the US Constitution, that is the Equal Rights Amendment, an amendment that is still pending and trying to make its way toward ratification. So with this, Hallie Quinn Brown, the National Association of Colored Women, and Black women more generally are left, if you will, left behind to build a new movement, to build their own movement, another chapter in the long history of voting rights activism in the United States. It is a movement that will continue to work through the sort of ground game of American politics that women in St. Louis had exemplified in 1920, getting one another registered, getting one another educated about voting rights, getting one another to the polls on election day. Nowhere better is this facet of the new movement exemplified than in the city of Chicago, where Black women will organize and use their power at the polls to, for example, elect the first African-American man since 1901 to Congress in 1928, Oscar DePriest. To do this, Black women must understand the political terrain. They must understand the mechanics of exercising the right to vote, and they must deliberate and vote as a bloc in order to put Oscar DePriest over the top in November of 1928, which they do. There is the ground game that is part of this new campaign. Secondly, African American women are part of the effort around litigation and lobbying that looks to transform the political landscape when it comes to voting rights. These are challenges to grandfather clauses, challenges to poll taxes, challenges to whites-only primaries that are a critical facet of this movement, chipping away at the edifice that is Jim Crow and paving the way for expanded access to the polls for Black Americans. Black women serve on the legal team at the NAACP, serve on that organization's board of directors, helping to guide this essential work that is part of the new campaign for voting rights. And finally, and importantly, from the 1940s forward, African American women are part of the grassroots efforts that characterize the modern civil rights era and force the hand of Congress, force the hand ultimately of President Lyndon Johnson, and bring us a Voting Rights Act in the year 1965, 45 years later. Here, African American women are part of the extraordinarily courageous, profoundly dangerous organizing work that brings not only a leadership cadre of women like Fannie Lou Hamer and Diane Nash, Septima Clark and Ella Baker to the fore of the voting rights struggle, but it brings hundreds and thousands of Black women who are part of the in the trenches work that is absolutely necessary as a companion to litigation, as a companion to exercising the right to vote when women can. It is essential to winning that federal legislation that Hallie Quinn Brown had been calling for back in 1920 when she gathered the women of the National Association of Colored Women to bring into being a new chapter in the movement for voting rights. Now today, the 19th Amendment continues to prohibit states from denying the vote to Americans based upon sex, just as the 15th Amendment forbids states from using race when determining voting rights. And still, here in 2020, many American women do not enjoy an unqualified right to vote. As was true 100 years ago, where a woman lives, for example, a fact that oftentimes correlates to her race, still keeps many women from the polls. Depending on where you live, voter ID laws, the shuttering of polling places, the purging of voter rolls, exact match requirements, all proclaim their purpose as neutral. And still we know that they deprive many American women, in particular women of color, from access to the polling place on election day. The policies of voting officials, especially in the context of a pandemic, mean that many American women will not be able to cast their ballots in the fall of 2020. And those that do, many of them are required to do so at the risk that they might indeed contract the coronavirus. It turns out, I think, in light of where we are in 2020, that the history of the 19th Amendment needs to be more than myth, needs to be more than a sanitized tale. Its details, its contours turn out to be a cautionary tale for our own time. And still, I think it would be a mistake to end on a note that suggested that nothing had changed since 1920, because indeed much has. And certainly, if in 1920 African American women were nearly unthinkable as voters for too many Americans, were unimaginable as a force in American politics, we see how over the course of the last 100 years, African American women have built themselves into figures who are far more than mere firsts in American politics. Collectively, African American women are a force. We need only look back as far as 2017 to that year's special election in the state of Alabama, where with a vacancy there, voters were called upon to elect a new senator to Washington. African American women in Alabama deliberated, they vetted the candidates, and threw their support behind the Democrat, Doug Jones. They not only deliberated and discriminated, they then organized one another to turn out on election day in remarkable numbers, in disproportionate numbers, such that when the ballots were counted in Alabama in that contest, Doug Jones not only was on his way to Washington, that Senate seat was flipped from red to blue in a US Senate where every vote, as we well know, counts. Let's look ahead, or let's look to our own moment, because I know some of us are already voting, whether it's early voting at polling places or mail-in votes or absentee ballots. Collectively, when we look at our ballots, what we discover is more than 120 Black American women running for office, running for Congress in 2020, looking to become a record-breaking force in Washington. The last high mark had been set in 2016 when 48 Black women ran for Congress. And so here in 2020, we see powerful evidence of the ways in which Black women are continuing to insist and to press themselves as a force of consequence in Washington. And none of us have missed the candidacy of Kamala Harris. We're gathered this evening, less than 24 hours after her debut as a candidate on the debate stage. But perhaps you were like me, and back in August when she accepted the nomination, you heard Senator Harris share something of her own history and her sense of history, and that history which has brought her to be the Democratic Party's candidate for the vice presidency in the fall of 2020. And first, Senator Harris paid tribute to her own mother, an immigrant to the United States, a scientist, a researcher, and someone who instilled in her two daughters a strong sense that their prospects were limitless, and at the same time, the ways in which their obligations to the collective, their obligations to humanity were important and should guide their work. And then Senator Harris went on in her acceptance speech to, if you will, name check 6 women who, all of whom are part of the vanguard of African American women that I have chronicled in my most recent book. Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the National Association of Colored Women. Ida B. Ida B. Wells, the journalist, uh, anti-lynching advocate, and also powerful suffrage organizer in the city of Chicago. Mary McLeod Bethune, who we've already met, who will go on after her work in voting rights in Florida to be a member of Franklin Roosevelt's Black Cabinet and one of 3 African-American delegates in 1945 to the founding of the United Nations. Diane Nash, the civil rights strategist and mastermind behind the student sit-ins in Nashville, Tennessee, the freedom rides across the South, and of course, the architect of the Selma campaign for voting rights that is decisive in pressing Congress and Lyndon Johnson to enact the Voting Rights Act. Fannie Lou Hamer, the sharecropper, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organizer and leader of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, who in 1964 comes to the Democratic National Convention that summer to decry a Democratic Party that would hold itself out as legitimate, while Black men and women had been barred from selecting the delegates who represented them at that convention. And finally, she invokes Constance Baker Motley. Perhaps that was predictable. Both Senator Harris and Constance Baker Motley were lawyers. But more importantly, Motley was a member of that NAACP team that had chipped away at Jim Crow through litigation. She had gone on to hold public office in New York, first in New York City, and then as a member of the New York State Legislature, and finally would be appointed for a lifetime of work on the federal bench, where her role continued to be to protect the civil rights and voting rights of all Americans. These are the women whom Kamala Harris name checks, Kamala Harris tells us are underneath her career, underneath her ambition, and underneath this historic moment in which she accepts the Democratic nomination as that party's vice president in 2020. Important for us to notice here, I think, is that Senator Harris does not invoke figures such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan Anthony or Lucretia Mott. She signals to us that there is a distinct history, a distinct story, a distinct trajectory for many African-American women in the 21st century. And her 6 women pantheon is one glimpse of that. I want to close, but before I do, I want to suggest what are for me 3 important lessons that come out of the story of the women of Vanguard for our own time. The first is that one about politics as a ground game. There's no substitute in every election cycle for doing the work that is voter education, that is voter mobilization, that is getting ourselves to the vote, to the polls, casting those ballots. That work has to continue. And at the same time, the women of Vanguard always attend to and always speak to their highest ideals. For the women I write about, it means that they are always insisting that American politics can do better. Better how? By eliminating the influence of racism and eliminating the influence of sexism, whether it comes to voting rights, holding office, party influence, and more. Black women are in the trenches doing that everyday work while they are also holding up their greatest ideals, and they encourage us to do the same. And then finally, these are women who know that politics is a long game. Someone like Mary McLeod Bethune, while she will spend a lifetime promoting the political power and influence and rights of African-American women, will not live long enough to see passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, even as she lives a very long life. And part of Bethune's work was to lay the foundation, prepare and promote the next generations who would, in their own lifetimes, confront voting rights challenges. The other night I gave a talk with an audience at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, in conversation with my colleague, Dr. Noelle Trent. And she asked me a question, and it's a question I want to leave you with this evening. And I think it is one that the women of Vanguard knew well how to answer. What sort of ancestor will you be? That question is a reminder that while the stakes are indeed high for us as we move into the immediate election season in 2020, that our work is always must have an eye on the futures of our daughters, of our granddaughters. And so as we reflect on this anniversary and we use it to inform our own work, I hope that you too will keep the long game of American politics very much present in your own mind. And so I think with that, I want to say thank you again very much for having me with you this evening. And I believe, Shelley, you're coming back to join me as we continue the conversation and open it up for questions. Thanks so much for doing this with me this evening.
Thank you so much, Professor Jones, for such an insightful and fascinating lecture on such an important topic. I'm excited to see that we already have some questions coming in for you. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Q&A, it's at the bottom of your screen and you just type in your questions and we'll get going now. So our first question is, how did the St. Louis success in registration express itself politically?
It's a great question. What it means is that now African-American women in St. Louis, while it will take a great deal of time for them to change the outcome on election day, are already becoming part of the Republican Party machine apparatus, which is so critical to politics in that city and across the country. It means that they are, by way of their affiliations in St. Louis, becoming part of the national Republican Party deliberations, which is shaping platforms, choosing candidates, and setting the party agenda broadly going forward. And so while the struggle over how to use those votes and change the outcome on any given election day remains a goal in St. Louis, there's no question but that willingness to be organized, to register, to be visible gives those same women influence. It means that when Mary McLeod Bethune gets to Washington, Franklin Roosevelt recognizes that she speaks not only for her own interests or for women in Florida, right, but for Black women who have very discernibly made their force felt through their contributions to the party in many parts of the country. So thank you for that question. It's an important one. It's also, I guess, the last thing, if I could, is just to say that that influence will be felt locally long before it is felt nationally. And so where Black women become effective very quickly, or in contests, say school board and school budget contests across the country, the election of aldermen and city council members is the case from the example in Chicago. And so local elections matter. I know in a presidential contest year, we can sometimes lose sight of what's down ballot, but I just got my ballot in the mail today. And I was reminded it is a long and ambitious document, in part because there's a great deal going on in my city down ballot. And this is going to be true in St. Louis as well.
Great, thank you. Our next question is a two-part question. First, how can we manage the voter intimidation recently seen and endorsed by the president? And part two, can you briefly discuss the angry Black woman phenomenon and how Black women can continue to their own truth?
Sure. Well, thank you for those two really important questions. The women I write about know well what it means to speak of intimidation and violence. And as I suggested in the example in St. Louis, but it's true in many places, Black women work through their existing associations, whether it's church or a YWCA, a club, a sorority, and they organize to come to the polls in numbers. In other words, they understand how especially vulnerable any given woman is if she arrives at election day alone, unaccompanied, in the face of folks who are determined to hang out and to be present, to catcall, and worse. In 1920, we even see evidence of this in the newspapers. You know, reporters remark on the ways in which Black women are denigrated. But there is, I think, a discernible and effective strength in coming out in numbers. Black women know what time they will come out. They gather before they head to the polls elsewhere and arrive in numbers. And we know a bit about this from practices like carpooling, which is often thought of as a convenience, right, in terms of getting folks to the polls. But it also means that we arrive in numbers and we know one another and we care for one another. Now, there are important resources now in all of our states, the numbers we can call to report voter intimidation. And that is something that is not available to women in 1920, that they cannot expect either Republican Party operatives quite yet or local officials, police, constables, magistrates to step up and defend them. And so this tactic of coming out in important numbers is the way in which Black women do that. And I expect that this will be part of the way that many of us will come to the polls, especially if we anticipate intimidation, that it's a very different experience to come out organized in your own group rather than alone and solo. That is the ground game work that we are in the midst of doing, I think many of us in 2020. The angry Black woman. I don't know if the questioner watched the debate last night, as I think Kamala Harris clearly worked deliberately, I would say elegantly, brilliantly, with and against the looming charge, right, that she was nothing more than someone who was angry. And I wonder if some of the commentary underscored what a joyful sort of personality she is, right? Someone who is easy to smile and easy to laugh, which I don't think is artifice at all. I don't think it's especially strategic, at least from where I sit. But nonetheless, I think the astute observers were correct that this serves her, right, as contrasted with someone like Mrs. Obama, who came to the political podium really unseasoned, right, inexperienced in American politics by and large. She emerges onto some of the biggest political stages in the country, be they the rallies during the campaign or the DNC convention in 2008. And we know that I think little more than her inexperience and her developing a persona and a personal style at the podium in real time was in essence used against her. And she became branded, not someone who was finding her footing or developing her style or still emerging in American politics, but someone who was angry. And I think it was that moment that, how can I put it, that revealed, right, the falseness, right, the artifice of the charge of the angry Black woman, because it didn't fit at all her circumstances, but it was the easy place for critics to reach in their critique. So I'm not sure if the question was prompting me to suggest an answer or a solution. But I do want to acknowledge that I think it is one facet, right, of stereotypes, mythology, and racism that Black women candidates must contend with, whatever their experience, whatever their personality or persona might be at the podium. I think that charge, that critique is continues to loom and is very much present.
Great, thank you for that. Our next question. I recently read an article about the sororities getting behind Kamala Harris. Do you think they will help bring the African American vote to bear?
Absolutely. The Divine Nine, who I think it's important to say have been a force in American politics, including a force in the political careers of Black women, going back for nearly as long as those organizations have been in existence. I'll turn the clock back all the way to 1913. Alice Paul, part of a renegade crew at the National American Women's Suffrage Association, organizes a parade in March of 1913, a suffrage parade in Washington on Pennsylvania Avenue, looking to upstage and begin to persuade President Woodrow Wilson to join and endorse women's suffrage. When Alice Paul does so, she initially is not confident about the sorts of numbers that she's going to be able to draw. She needs a lot of women, right, to make a strong impression and to really bump up against and upstage President Wilson. And she turns to the young women of Delta Sigma Theta Incorporated, newly organized at Howard University. Those young Black women from Howard, those sorority members, make up a very important contingent of women at that meeting. And so the women we see today identified with Delta Sigma Theta and many others of the Black women's sororities are coming out of a long tradition of political activism.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Our next question. Who would Shirley Chisholm have name-checked, or did she name-check?
Oh, thank you for that. Perhaps all of us know Shirley Chisholm, but I'll just mention briefly, hailing from Brooklyn, New York, Chisholm serves in the New York State legislature and then is the first African-American woman elected to Congress in 1968 and won for president in 1972. Among the women I'm quite sure she would name check is Harriet Tubman. Why do I say that? Not only because Tubman is another great African-American New Yorker, but because when Chisholm was a young woman, she was a student at New York City's Brooklyn College. And there was a member of the Harriet Tubman Society. And that is in part where Tubman learns history and politics from an African-American perspective. There in an organization she and others name expressly for Harriet Tubman. And I love this dimension of African-American women's political practice, the things we learn by way of naming, the way history is passed forward by naming. I mentioned earlier, in St. Louis, Black women in 1920 are organized in the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, pulling on a history from the late 18th century to inform their politics in the 20th. So Harriet Tubman, I think, would certainly be on her list. She had an important role to play in the political coming of age of a young Shirley Chisholm. I apologize if I'm not hearing you.
There we go. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thank you.
First, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And the question is, of the 46 women who ran for Congress, how many of them won?
That's a great question that I should know the answer to, and I don't. So thank you for that. The numbers come from Rutgers University, and where they have been very carefully tracking these numbers as they grow and shift and change. So you'll forgive me for not knowing how many actually win in 2016. And at the same time, I would say, I think what's important about that number is, yes, how many women are successful, but I would also say how many are inspired. That part of what I think is at stake in any given season is the effect of seeing Black women candidates, seeing Black women on the ballot. The organization Higher Heights has been one of the essential grassroots organizations taking that kind of inspiration and making sure that we know precisely what to do with it to get ourselves on the ballot. So thank you for the question. And I'm going to do a little homework when we hang up today so that I know the answer to that question next time someone asks me.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Our next question, first, hello, and thank you for a wonderful lecture. And although I am proud to say that Kamala Harris, a woman who identifies as Black, is running to be our next VP, how do we unite the Black diaspora without erasing the experience and battles that African Americans, specifically descendants of slaves in this country, have endured?
The answer I have for that is a historian's answer, right? Which is to say that I take the question to be underscoring that there might be something lost in the politics of 2020 that regards or situates Kamala Harris in the same historical trajectory. She, the daughter of immigrants from India and from Jamaica, as contrasted with Black Americans who are many generations descended from people in the United States. I think one answer is history, and so part of my work, if you will, and my work collectively with so many other historians of Black America, the Black diaspora, and more, is to keep alive all of those threads that interweave into a sense of Pan-African, diasporic, or Black history that is not particular or exclusive to the US. And at the same time, I'm someone who, in hearing Kamala Harris invoke the names of 6 Black American foremothers, all of them, if I'm not mistaken, descended from people enslaved in the US, is a reminder that our political imaginations are never limited by the facts of our genealogy or our personal histories. That when Kamala Harris invokes those women, I don't think it's to reduce herself to that experience or to subsume that experience into her own. It's to expand our political imagination to suggest that lines that are sociological and historical are not the end of what our politics can and should be. I don't want to put words in Senator Harris's mouth. I think she should answer that question for herself. But I would say for me, I'm very interested in encouraging all of us to study and learn about the women whom I foreground in a book like Vanguard, and to ask the question, how is your political imagination transformed? Not because you are those women or you are even like them in some sociological sense, but because they stand for experiences, for values, for visions of our future that all of us can be, I think, in my view, a part of.
Thank you. Our next question: how do you believe we can join together as Black and white women to engage men in productive conversations that will lead them to better understand their oppression of women in politics, in professions, and in family life?
Well, there's an enormous question, if ever there was one, but an important one. And I can only tell you my approach to these sorts of questions and these sorts of dynamics. I believe the hardest way to do that is by lecturing and hectoring. I think the hardest way to open people's minds, whether it's to other experiences, to their own shortcomings, to new ways of seeing the world. The hardest way to do that is by direct confrontation. And part of what is not wholly distinct, but is very characteristic of the women whom I write about in Vanguard is that they never abandon the organizations, the institutions, the spaces that they share with men. So the women I write about do organize for women's votes, but they do it in churches where they share the polity and the power with men. They do it in civil rights organizations where they are members and leaders alongside men. And I believe that people, sometimes our best opportunities to transform one another are when we work in community with one another. And the women I write about have mighty struggles with men. But I hope for those of you who have a chance to read the book, you'll discover those moments in which they are remarkably successful at a set of sustained conversations, debates, sometimes fraught, that lead to transformation and, if you will, convert men to a woman-centered point of view on politics and power. But I think our best shot at that is in community. It is in those spaces where we already collaborate with one another. That might be the classroom, that might be a faculty meeting, it might be your church Sunday school. We have to work, I think, in those spaces that we share. And there, I think we have a special kind of opportunity to also persuade.
Great, thank you. Next question. Did you note that 2 women won the Nobel for Chemistry and the headlines read "Scientist, not women"? Is there a time when we will no longer append Black to the title?
It's a hard question, isn't it? Because the appending, as you put it, of the term Black is stands in for a remark that doesn't fit in the headline, right? Or in a brief comment or the soundbite, which is that part of the frame for this accomplishment is racism, right? The reason we note the women scientists in part is because the frame still of their achievements is sexism within the training and the practice and the profession, the publishing and more in science. So, well, I think there is a view that would say it's a kind of belittling distinction. Women scientists are scientists, Black women scientists are scientists. I don't think we're quite at a time where it is irrelevant to underscore that women scientists, Black women scientists, are such only in part because they have endured, confronted, worked through, and otherwise had to grapple with racism and sexism in order to accomplish something as, I take it, distinguished as the work done to merit a Nobel citation. So I don't think we're quite there yet. I'm not a fan of the, the first women this and the first women that. There are too many women scientists, right, to tokenize women scientists, I might say. And at the same time, one take on the headline is to remind us that there still are many impediments between ourselves as women, ourselves as Black women, and some of these distinctions. At least that's how I see it.
Thank you. Our next question. In what ways do you see social media affecting the ground game of politics? Could it potentially dilute the strength of a localized voting bloc, or does it open up other possibilities?
I am not a political scientist, so I'm not going to go fully down the road with this. But I will say, I hope and expect that our colleagues in political science are very tuned in to these precise questions. I know that they are, and in particular, are examining the role that artificial intelligence plays in priming, shaping, influencing messages and how we receive messages. Someone just shared a fascinating report with me about the ways in which AI messaging geared toward women can come in more than one form. Some of it results in a sort of demeaning and deflating response, and others of it a kind of empowering and activating response. And part of what this report explained is that too much of this research has not yet particularized or atomized variables like sex and race, so that we understand better how these new modes of politics, these new modes of influence, these new modes of organizing are working. So this is cutting edge work that I'm, for one, am very interested in and tuned into. But I can't say I have an answer precisely. I hang out on social media, but I'm like a lot of us. I'm really an amateur there for the news and the humor, and every once in a while for the teaching of history too.
Thank you for that. And this will be our final question for the evening. In your opinion, who was the most influential leader of the women's suffrage movement in the US? Why does their voice stand above others in the call to get women the right to vote?
Thank you for that. I confess in the last pages of this book the answer to that question, but I won't keep you in suspense. And instead, I'll tell you that my answer is Ida B. Wells. For those who don't already know Ida Wells, she grows up, comes of age, an orphan, the oldest of many children, becomes a school teacher, turns a corner in her political sensibilities when she is violently forced out of a lady's car when traveling home to her family in Memphis, Tennessee, she sues the railroad for having bought a ticket and then being denied the seat that she'd paid for because she was African American. Wells goes on to be a journalist, heading her own newspaper in Memphis, a wickedly sharp pen, an equally sharp tongue, who has another conversion when neighbors, men, friends in Memphis, storekeepers are lynched. And it is an epiphany for Wells. And she becomes the convener, the social scientist, the most forceful advocate for anti-lynching legislation in the United States. For a very long time, Ida Wells's research on the numbers of lynching, on the fact of lynching, which was denied by many Americans at the end of the 19th century. Her work was our best social scientifically styled knowledge about the history of lynching. Wells is internationally known for her anti-lynching work and her journalism, but she's also a suffragist, and eventually makes her home in the city of Chicago, where she works remarkably and importantly with white suffragists on women's votes in Illinois. Women in that state will get the vote in 1913. She will found the Afro Suffrage Club, one of the early Black women's suffrage clubs, and will be there in 1913 at that march I already mentioned for the presence of the women of the Delta Sigma Theta Incorporated. Ida Wells is also there, part of a Chicago contingent, and will be part of a dust-up around where and how Black women will march and participate in that parade. I admire her deeply because she's extraordinarily talented, because she is extraordinarily courageous. She has a unparalleled fashion sense. Take a look at the portraits of Ida Wells and you'll appreciate that she understands the power of the image and crafts her own image with great effect. And her versatility and her multifacetedness is very characteristic of the women in Vanguard. She is never one issue. She is never of one strategy or tactic. I had the honor last evening in Chicago at the City Lit bookstore to be with Ida Wells's great-granddaughter, Michelle Duster. And through Michelle Duster's work, I've come to really appreciate that Wells continues to have a powerful influence as an inspiration, as a role model, and more to Americans, including African-American women even today. So that is my confession. I don't think historians are supposed to have favorites and that sort of thing. But if you ask me, the answer is Ida B. Wells.
Thank you for that. And thank you for spending the evening with us and for such an informative and, again, fascinating conversation. We really appreciate the time you spent with us.
Well, I thank you all very much for this, and I appreciate the memorable questions and conversation, and I look forward to seeing you all at the ballot box, at least figuratively, in the coming weeks.
We will be there. So folks, that concludes this evening's program, and I hope you'll be able to join us on October 20th for our final event, The Role of Indigenous Peoples in Women's Suffrage. Thank you again, Professor Jones, and good night, everyone.